Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome into a brand new edition of the College Football Smoak Break. It is championship week, the regular season now over, but as much drama and craziness as ever still going on in the sport of college football, for better or for worse. A lot of people throwing fits over playoff seedings and non-conference schedulings, and a lot of people pulling their hair out over coach hirings and firings. And well, a lot of that's still to be determined, both in the playoff setting and also in the coaching setting. But we do have some things that have been finalized after the last week of the regular season wrapped up and conference championship games are set. Plus, a lot of jobs have been filled. And on a shorter show like the Smoak Break, it's going to be really difficult to get to all of it. We will do our best to try to cover what we can here on a Tuesday and then look forward to championship weekend and those matchups on the Thursday edition of the Smoak Break. But the big stories from this past week, two of them really involving the coaching carousel. Lane Kiffin, you might have heard of him, been talked about quite a bit. Ultimately, after a back and forth battle in his mind, although I don't know how much of a battle it actually was. I think it was how much can I still get without giving up too much before I'm actually forced out of the door. Lane Kiffin eventually told by Ole Miss that he would not be able to continue having his cake and eating it too, taking another job and coaching the Rebels through the playoffs. Ultimately having to make the call this past weekend after a big Egg Bowl win on Black Friday. And as we have all seen now, Lane Kiffin, the biggest domino in the coaching carousel, tipping over and heading on to Baton Rouge to become the new head coach at LSU. And apparently after some talking to by the likes of Nick Saban and Pete Carroll, and Lane basically establishing in his opening press conference that in so many words, Nick Saban said, go take that LSU job, and Pete Carroll did too. And ultimately, I think he didn't really need that motivation, but it doesn't hurt to have guys like that saying, no, yeah, you should go take that job. But however Lane attempted to rationalize his decision, LSU versus Ole Miss, with all due respect to Ole Miss, LSU is the better job, and it is a premier job in the country. Whereas LSU is as good of a job as it is because of some history, but also because of what Lane Kiffin has done recently. So I think he can be happy with what's been accomplished there in Oxford, but I'm not surprised at all to see him move. But it was an interesting 24-plus hour saga. And really, as far as the coverage goes, like a week-plus saga to see him ultimately make the move that a lot of people thought he would make. And in turn, Ole Miss turns around and elevates Pete Golding, attempting to maintain as much as they possibly can heading into this playoff run. But interesting to not only go in-house and hold on to Pete Golding, who is a guy that's been rumored to at some point here in the future be a candidate for other jobs, but wasn't in this particular cycle, which is maybe a red flag, maybe not. We'll see how time plays out. But going and making the move and doing so swiftly to try to maintain as much of their current success as they can. Time will tell if that was the right move or not, but in a pinch and without a whole lot of time to go any other direction, I think Ole Miss and Pete Golding make a lot of sense as a combination. I'm glad the Lane circus as far as this particular chapter is over, but in Baton Rouge, there are more elements to have an even bigger circus than we could even imagine. There's also the elements to have more success than he's ever had in his career, despite being at several high-profile schools and in the NFL as well at this point. But one domino leads to another. And then it just felt like dominoes were falling everywhere on Sunday in the SEC as the Ole Miss job opens and quickly closes. The LSU job closes. Florida hires John Sumrall. Auburn gets Alex Golish, and Arkansas turns around and hires Ryan Silverfield for Memphis. Then here's Kentucky, thought maybe they wouldn't move on from Mark Stoops, but after a historic blowout loss to Louisville, they too throw their hat into the ring and very quickly pivot to Oregon OC Will Stein. So the SEC, an absolute one conference news cycle when it came to the coaching carousel this past weekend. So yeah, Ole Miss, Florida, Auburn, Arkansas, and Kentucky, and LSU, and Ole Miss all getting new coaches put in place, and some other movement across the country over the last few days. Saw Oklahoma State hiring Eric Morris. Really like that hire. Really like these other hires as well, and we'll take more time to delve into them in the offseason. But you also had, of course, another move that's still very much out there at this point, not involving the SEC, but the Big 12 and the Big 10, as we all wait on pins and needles. And by the time you watch or listen to this, maybe it's been decided, but Penn State making the move on BYU head coach Kalani Sitake over the past few days. And apparently, according to some reports, going so far as to have reached a handshake agreement this past weekend. It looked like Sitake was going to end up going to Happy Valley, as out of nowhere as that sounds. And it is somewhat out of nowhere given his extreme ties to BYU, both as a football player, as a coach, also as a member of the church. Just wouldn't have thought that Penn State would be enticing, but then again, it's a big-time job and a big-time league, and it seemed as though maybe it was going to be enticing enough to pull Kalani Sitake, but here in the last 24 hours, you've had CEOs of cookie companies starting to do their part to retain Kalani Sitake there in Provo, and an outpouring of support, not only from the fan base and his supporters, but also the school doing its job as expediently as possible to put together a package to convince Kalani Sitake that he is the one and only for BYU, and he needs to remain where he is. And after looking like Penn State might be the move for Kalani Sitake, he is the biggest domino now, and this Penn State job, the biggest domino yet to fall. And if I were to guess at this moment, barring just some desire for a fresh backdrop, scenery backdrop refresh, or just a desire to just be somewhere else for a few years, I think Kalani Sitake and all that's been done over the last 48 hours or so should be enough to sway him, however much he was swaying the other direction. And if anything, a little bit of a gamble, a little bit of a negotiation on his part. But perhaps he never really wanted to leave Provo because of all the ties that I mentioned. He is at worst going to get very well compensated, and maybe even more importantly, his staff is going to be far more compensated. His roster, his NIL budget will see far more compensation. And maybe that was the goal all along. If so, great moves on the chessboard by Sitake. But we will see, as that decision seems like it is imminent, and don't know when he might pull the plug on making that official. But obviously, interesting timing given the Big 12 championship game this weekend. So if he could go ahead and make that decision the next day or so that BYU fans can turn their attention to the present and then a very bright future with Sitake not going anywhere for any conceivable job at this point, that would be a great way to turn this week around. But started off on a weird note, obviously, when you're preparing for a conference championship game, and all of a sudden a guy who you thought would never be a possibility elsewhere is suddenly looking like he could be on the move. This has been wild to watch unfold over the last couple of days, but it does appear as though BYU has done enough now to secure Sitake in place, and it would take just him, again, wanting a new challenge to lead Provo. So that is the domino that we now wait to watch fall. And what a just wild carousel this has been. As much as it is messy, it is also entertaining. And there is the give and the take of it all. Probably not healthy for the sport when you've got Lane Kiffin leaving Ole Miss before their playoff run. Probably not the greatest thing when Kalani Sitake is preparing his team to try to win their first Big 12 conference title, and he's out there being dangled as the next head coach at Penn State. But it is what it is. There's long podcasts and conversations that can be had about the calendar. But this is how the sport is currently set up, and I don't necessarily agree with it. But I'm also not going to expend the energy on trying to fix something that's not fixable right now, because there's just simply not the leadership in place to do really much, if at all, about it. Although a lot of great ideas are out there, no movement on actually trying to correct this calendar and make it a bit more of a manageable type of situation with these coach hirings and firings conflicting with signing recruits and also wrapping up your seasons as well. So until they make some major tweaks there, we're going to have this kind of chaos. And as much as it is messy, it's also fun messy. And certainly these past few days have been that. So there you had like a brief summary of the coaching carousel and some fun hires that, again, I'll talk about on 365 Sports a bit more in depth. But the Kiffin saga, what a roller coaster. And the Sitake saga, not as big nationally, but, man, what does Penn State do if they don't land him? And it looks like they probably won't at this point. And if, let's say, he were to turn to Penn State, what in the hell does BYU do? Because you talk about slim pickings. It's not exactly let's go out and just get the biggest name possible. It's a bit more complex than that. But hopefully for them, and it looks like thankfully for them, that's not something they're going to have to worry about filling a head coaching spot for quite a long time. But still to be determined on that front. Meanwhile, had 5 big games we picked over the weekend. Did okay, finished above 500 as far as the picks, but really enjoyed the banger, so to speak, of this week. Florida State was a whatever game. Florida State, just a complete mess, and Mike Norvell very much feels like a lame duck coach. Nice win by the Gators as they now turn their attention towards this big John Summerall hire, and this should be a very fruitful offseason for them. So what a way to close out what was otherwise a very forgettable season. The firing of Billy Napier, turning around, beating your rival, hiring and just further pouring salt into their wound as they have to sit with their coach that they despise and want to get rid of at this point. You turn around and hire a new coach in John Summerall. So heck of a weekend for the Florida Gators. Texas over A&M on Black Friday. Great win for the Longhorns. It's now led into a lot of complaining and hand-wringing and in a lot of cases flat out whining about non-conference schedules and Texas being the victim of playing Ohio State, and I have no energy to get into that either, but I did think it was a very impressive win over A&M, a program that Texas just owns. I mean, they pretty much just do. You could see this coming from a mile away, and you can go back to shows of ours from the last couple of months where we said, watch A&M go unbeaten all the way to the end, and they're going to lose to Texas. Now, fortunately for them, the playoffs expanded, and so they still are in the playoff despite that loss, but they are not in the SEC championship game. And that had to be an ultimate goal. So Texas, with a bit of a double whammy on A&M, couldn't knock them out of the playoff, but did throw a little bit of kryptonite their way. And Texas A&M, after looking like a team who was rightfully complaining about not being the number one team in the country there a few times of the weeks that went by, now looking like a team that is very vulnerable heading into this college football playoff, whereas Texas has as a case for why they should maybe get a longer look, but I don't think it's a case that should lead to them actually being in this year's playoffs. I understand the argument, but if you didn't lose to Ohio State or if you didn't play to Ohio State contains the word if, and you did do those things. And so let's talk about that in a year where those things don't happen. But in this year, you did play them, you did lose, and you did lose 3 games. And therefore, this year, I don't feel like you belong in the playoff. But I get the argument about the bigger picture stuff. Miami over Pitt, that wasn't too difficult for the Hurricanes, who now are another team with a very interesting playoff discussion because they, due to tiebreakers, do not end up in the ACC championship game. And on the outside looking in, how does the committee handle Miami and Notre Dame in this final batch of rankings? We knew this conversation was bubbling up, and it would depend greatly on how the season finished out. But with Miami now winning their final game but not playing for the conference title, it does make what the committee says on Tuesday night that much more of an interesting discussion and debate, given how they are going to handle that. But the Canes, no problem dispatching the Panthers. Vandy at Tennessee kind of turned into what I expected it to. I thought Diego Pavia would have his big Heisman kind of showing and finish the story, so to speak, against the rival Volunteers on the road in Pavia fashion. And there he was, flashing the Heisman pose and running wild and making big plays. And after a very tight contest in the early stages, Vandy eventually pulls away. And it was just kind of what I pictured it to be, with Pavia standing tall at the end. And I don't have a Heisman vote, but I would be hard-pressed to give it to somebody else. As compelling as some other cases are, Pavia is a very fun Heisman selection if you go that route, which we'll see how many voters end up doing that. But, man, what an entertaining player, and we only are probably going to get one more game out of him. But what a run it's been, and what a storybook win over Tennessee that was. And then in the game, Ohio State takes down Michigan without too much trouble. Michigan hoping to get into the playoff in the Big Ten title game, but the Buckeyes go wire to wire undefeated. And now this massive showdown with Indiana coming up this weekend ought to be incredible. But those games kind of going about as expected. I mean, Texas over A&M, definitely a stunner, but not in like crazy fashion. Kind of par for the course, actually, more than stunning. And besides that, Florida over Florida State, I mean, it's I mean, that game was as a coin flip and a couple of teams who are quite messy, although Florida now feeling much better about them circumstances with the new hire. But the conference championship games are set. not much in the way of too much disruption this past week, and a very fun week on the horizon now as we will get things started with the American, North Texas and Tulane for a playoff spot on Friday. And then on Saturday, BYU and Tech, Georgia, Bama, Indiana, Ohio State, and yes, that very odd ACC title game of Duke and Virginia. Virginia to the playoff if they win. Duke to the playoff if they win. Maybe not, depending on where they fall. Maybe two group of 5 teams. There is some drama, certainly still remaining on championship weekend, despite the discourse about conference championship games not mattering as much anymore. There are still some stakes in play, even though most of the teams I just mentioned have, in the case of the SEC and Big Ten, all 4 booked their tickets. That's still not determined as far as BYU and Tech. Looking like if Tech wins, BYU could be on the outside looking in, which in itself is another big debate. And then Duke and Virginia, a potential doomsday scenario for the ACC. What a sport, what a weekend, what a news cycle. And on Thursday, we will talk actually about these games and talk about the college football playoff and the final set of rankings. But Lane Kiffin to LSU, Kalani Sitake is going to be richly rewarded and maybe competing with Texas Tech for NIL budgets and things like that if he stays in the Big 12, or one of the biggest coaching out of nowhere type moves that we've seen in a really long time. By the time you listen to this, hopefully there's a resolution, and I hope for BYU's sake that's with Kalani Sitake still being their head coach. But we will see on that. What a sport, and more to get to on the next edition of the College Football Smoak Break. Until next time, I'm Craig Smoak.